The Case of the Fox and Hound. It was a crisp autumn evening in the year 1897, during the very height of the fox hunting season, when my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes and I found ourselves drawn into one of his most intriguing yet curiously domestic adventures. The streets of Belgravia lay shrouded in a thick London fog, that peculiar yellow-grey mantle which so often descends upon our great city, muffling sounds and softening the harsh edges of the world. Gas lamps flickered like hesitant stars along the pavements, casting pools of dim light upon the wet cobblestones, while the occasional clatter of horse-drawn cabs echoed distantly, as if from another realm altogether. Holmes and I had dined quietly at Baker Street, and finding the evening uneventful, he had suggested a short constitutional walk to clear the mind. It was during this stroll that we turned into Passmore Street, drawn perhaps by the warm glow emanating from a modest corner public house known as the Fox and Hounds, a favourite resort of the local hunting fraternity. The sign above the door, depicting a sly fox glancing back at a pursuing hound, creaked gently in the breeze, and through the mullioned windows we could glimpse a scene of conviviality, gentlemen in tweeds and riding boots, raising tankards amid clouds of pipe smoke, their voices carrying tales of the chase across misty fields. The interior, as we soon discovered upon entering, was the very picture of traditional English comfort. Dark oak beams crossed the low ceiling, adorned with hanging tankards and the occasional mounted fox mask or antler trophy. The walls were lined with faded prints of famous hunts, scenes of scarlet-coated riders leaping hedges, hounds in full cry, and the quarry vanishing into covert. A roaring fire crackled in the grate, casting dancing shadows, while the air was rich with the mingled scents of ale, tobacco, polished wood, and a faint, earthy hint of damp wool from drying coats. Prominently displayed behind the bar, upon a stand of deep crimson velvet, rested the object that would soon become the centre of our attention, a magnificent antique silver hunting horn. This was no ordinary instrument, but a true heirloom of exquisite workmanship, fashioned in the early part of the century and passed down through generations of a distinguished family. The horn tapered gracefully, its sterling silver surface gleaming softly in the lamplight, hallmarked with the finest London marks. Most striking was the intricate engraving that chased its curve, a vigorous scene of a hound in ardent pursuit of a fleeing fox, every detail rendered with remarkable vitality. The strain of the hound's muscles, the cunning twist of the fox's brush, the swirling foliage of the woodland beyond. It was while we stood warming ourselves by the fire, Holmes idly surveying the room with that penetrating gaze of his, that a gentleman of military bearing approached us. He was a tall, erect figure in his late 60s, with a weather-beaten face framed by white whiskers, dressed in a well-cut tweed suit that spoke of country life. This, as he introduced himself, was Colonel Reginald Hargreaves, retired from the cavalry and master of the Belgravia hunt. His countenance bore an expression of profound distress, and after a brief exchange of pleasantries, during which Holmes's name evidently struck a chord, he drew us aside to a quieter corner. "Mr. Holmes," he began in a low, urgent voice, "I have heard of your extraordinary talents, and Providence seems to have placed you here this very evening. A most perplexing theft has occurred, and I fear it touches upon matters of family honour and old associations," he went on to explain. The previous night, following a successful meet of the hunt, the members had gathered here at the Fox and Hounds for their customary celebration. The room had been crowded with familiar faces, hunters, grooms, and followers of the sport, toasting the day's exploits with stirrup cups and recounting thrilling moments of the chase. The silver horn, pride of the colonel's family and a traditional centerpiece of such gatherings, had occupied its usual place behind the bar. Yet when the landlord came to lock up, and the colonel glanced once more at the treasured relic before departing. It was gone, vanished utterly, without trace or witness, from a crowded public room in the heart of London. The colonel feared not merely the loss of a valuable artifact, worth, he confessed, a small fortune, but the scandal that might arise. The horn was linked to an old and exclusive society of hunters, whose members guarded certain traditions jealously. Rumours of rivalries and unsettled debts already whispered through the room, and the theft threatened to unearth unpleasant secrets. Holmes listened intently, his eyes narrowing with that familiar spark of interest. "A disappearance under such circumstances," he remarked, "presents features of the utmost intrigue. Pray, Colonel, permit me to examine the premises at once." Thus began what would come to be known in my private chronicles as the case of the Fox and Hound, a mystery where the cunning of the quarry would prove no match for the relentless pursuit of truth. The morning following our encounter with Colonel Hargreaves dawned grey and drizzly, as so many London mornings do. Holmes, who had passed the night in silent contemplation, his long fingers steepled, his eyes fixed upon the ceiling, roused me early with that quiet urgency which always signalled the hunt was on. By 9 o'clock we were once more at the Fox and Hounds, the landlord having granted us private access before the house opened to its customary patrons. The place seemed smaller and more ordinary in daylight, stripped of the previous evening's warmth and mystery. The fire was cold ash in the grate, the tankards hung silent, and the hunting prints on the walls appeared faded and commonplace. Yet to Sherlock Holmes, every detail spoke volumes. He moved about the room with that peculiar gliding step of his sharp eyes missing nothing, his lean figure stooping now and then to examine some trifling mark that would have escaped any ordinary observer. We began, naturally, at the scene of the disappearance itself, the spot behind the bar where the silver horn had rested upon its velvet stand. The stand remained exactly as it had been, square, solid, and raised upon a small shelf so that the horn might be seen by all. The crimson velvet bore a faint circular impression where the mouth of the horn had pressed for years, and a thin layer of dust had already begun to settle upon it, undisturbed save for one narrow streak where a finger, or perhaps a gloved hand, had brushed lightly across the edge. Holmes produced his powerful lens and bent low over the stand. "Observe, Watson," said he. "The dust lies evenly upon 3 sides, yet here upon the left it has been disturbed within the last 24 hours. Not wiped clean, one would notice that, but lightly brushed, as though something had been slid carefully away rather than lifted outright." I confessed I could see little beyond the faint mark he indicated, but I had long since ceased to be astonished at his perception. He next turned his attention to the floor beneath the shelf, a scattering of sawdust, fresh sprinkled each evening by the landlord to absorb spills. Here again the lens came into play. Holmes traced several boot prints, some heavy and clear, others half obliterated by later passage. Most were the broad nailed boots of grooms or huntsmen, but 2 sets stood out, one lighter, narrower, with a distinctive worn patch on the outer heel, the other deeper on the return journey, as though the wearer had carried additional weight. "Curious," murmured Holmes. Our thief approached lightly, yet departed burdened. The horn, though slender, is solid silver and by no means negligible in weight. From the bar he passed to the floor of the main room, crawling upon hands and knees in a manner that would have drawn stares had the pub been open. Near the corner closest to the bar he paused and gathered a pinch of ash from among the sawdust. He examined it closely, then transferred it carefully to a small envelope. "Turkish," he said simply. "Latakia blended with a trace of Perique, expensive and smoked by very few in this company. Mark it well, Watson." I did mark it, though at the time its significance escaped me entirely. Holmes then requested the landlord to show us the cellar door, a narrow portal behind the bar secured by a simple bolt and padlock. The wood around the keyhole bore a fresh scratch, faint but unmistakable, as though a key had been inserted hurriedly in the dark. The landlord, a stout, honest fellow named Briggs, protested that he alone possessed the key and had noticed nothing amiss. Holmes merely smiled and requested permission to descend. The cellar beneath the Fox and Hounds was low-ceilinged and cool, lined with barrels and crates of ale and spirits. A thin film of dust lay upon the stone floor, broken here and there by the landlord's own heavy footprints. Holmes's lens swept slowly across the flags until it halted near a stack of empty crates in the far corner. There, beneath a loose floorboard, known it seemed to regulars as a convenient hiding place for contraband tobacco during bygone smuggling days, was a small, fresh disturbance. The board had been lifted and replaced, but not quite flush. A thin gap betrayed it, and beneath, the earth showed the faint outline of a rectangular object lately removed. Holmes straightened and regarded the scene with evident satisfaction. "The horn rested here but briefly," said he. "Our thief intended a temporary concealment only, long enough to deflect suspicion, before retrieving it at leisure. Yet something or someone caused him to alter his plan." Returning upstairs, Holmes questioned Briggs closely about the previous evening's gathering. The landlord confirmed that the room had been crowded from 7 until near midnight, with perhaps 30 souls present. Hunters, fresh from the field, their followers, a few local tradesmen, and the usual habitués of the house. No stranger had been remarked, and no commotion reported. The colonel himself had been among the last to leave, glancing fondly at his heirloom before bidding the company good night. It was only when Briggs returned to clear the bar that he noticed the stand empty. Holmes listened with closed eyes, then asked to speak with the young barmaid, Miss Elsie Thorne, who had served throughout the evening. She proved a bright, observant girl of 20 or so, with sharp, dark eyes and a ready memory. She recalled serving drinks to all the principals. The colonel hearty with port, Mr. Felix Reynard lingering over brandy, Jem Barker nursing a single pint in the corner, and Captain Arthur Hargreaves, the colonel's nephew, laughing loudly with a group near the fire. She had overheard fragments, talk of debts, a raised voice saying, "That horn will be mine yet," and later the captain complaining of family obligations while praising the wisdom of insurance. Holmes thanked her gravely, his expression betraying nothing. As we stepped back into the drizzling street, he remarked, almost to himself, "The pieces begin to fall into place, Watson. A theft not of opportunity but of careful design, executed in plain sight, yet concealed by the very bustle that should have prevented it. We have only to identify the hand that brushed the dust, scattered the ash, and trod more heavily on departure. I confess the mystery seemed to me as opaque as the fog that still clung to Belgravia's streets. Yet I had learned to trust my friend's methods, and I awaited developments with that mixture of anticipation and wonder that his cases never failed to evoke. With the premises thoroughly examined and the silent clues catalogued in that remarkable brain of his, Holmes turned his attention to the human element of the affair, the men and women who had filled the Fox and Hounds on the night of the theft. Colonel Hargreaves, anxious to avoid open scandal, had provided a discreet list of those present, and it was upon these individuals that suspicion must inevitably fall. Holmes, with his customary thoroughness, insisted upon interviewing each in turn, and I accompanied him as he sought them out over the succeeding days. First among them was Mr. Felix Reynard, a gentleman whose name seemed almost too apt for the circumstances. He was a slender, sharp-featured man in his mid-30s, with a mop of fiery red hair and a restless, fox-like glint in his pale eyes. In hunting circles he was known simply as the Fox. a nickname earned not merely from his colouring but from his reputation for cunning at the card table and racecourse. Reynard made no secret of his debts. Indeed, he wore them with a kind of rakish pride, as though financial embarrassment were merely another wager yet to be settled. We found him at his lodgings in Half Moon Street, lounging in a dressing gown amid scattered racing forms. He received us with a disarming smile and professed himself delighted to assist the famous Mr. Holmes. He admitted to having been at the gathering. Indeed, he had lingered near the bar for much of the evening, nursing a brandy and watching the Colonel's horn with open admiration. "A magnificent piece," he said lightly. "One might almost be tempted, were one that sort of fellow." Holmes noted that Reynard had been seen tracing idle patterns in a puddle of spilled brandy near the stand. Patterns that, in the sawdust later, bore a passing resemblance to fox paws. Reynard laughed it off as absent-minded doodling with the tip of his decorative walking stick, a handsome Malacca cane topped with an ivory fox's head. Yet his laughter rang a trifle hollow, and his eyes shifted when Holmes inquired about his current creditors. Next we sought out Jem Barker, the Colonel's huntsman of nearly 30 years' standing. If Reynard was the fox, then Barker was unquestionably the hound, lean, weathered, and unwaveringly loyal. His weathered face looked like old leather, and his grey eyes held the patient watchfulness of a dog that has spent its life quartering coverts. He lived in humble quarters above the Colonel's stables, surrounded by harness and crops and the faint comforting scent of horses. Barker spoke softly, with the slow cadence of the country, and his devotion to his master was plain in every word. He had been among the last to leave the pub that night, having waited to assist the Colonel into his cab. He denied any knowledge of the theft, yet admitted to deep anxiety. One of the Colonel's favourite foxhounds had gone missing the same evening, only to be found wandering near the pub at dawn, its paws muddy and its coat bearing traces of sawdust. Holmes questioned him closely about the missing dog, but Barker could offer no explanation beyond the vagaries of hounds. I noticed, however, that his heavy boots bore nails in a pattern not unlike certain of the deeper prints Holmes had observed in the sawdust. Barker's poverty was evident. His coat was patched, his wages modest. Might loyalty stretched to breaking by want have turned to desperation? Holmes said nothing, but I saw him file the possibility away. We then spoke with Miss Elsie Thorne, the young barmaid whose sharp memory had already proved valuable. She received us in the private parlour of the pub during a quiet afternoon hour, her apron neatly folded and her dark hair pinned severely back. Despite her youth, she possessed a cool self-possession and a remarkable eye for detail. She had served every drink that night and had observed the company with the detached interest of one who sees much yet, is seldom noticed herself. She recalled Mr. Reynard's lingering near the bar, his fingers idly circling in spilled liquor. She remembered Jem Barker sitting quietly in his corner, nursing one pint for hours. Most vividly, she recalled a fragment of conversation overheard near closing time. Captain Arthur Hargreaves, the Colonel's nephew, had been speaking heatedly to a companion about family burdens and the wisdom of protecting one's assets through prudent insurance. Moments later, another voice, low and angry, had muttered the words, "That horn will be mine yet." She could not swear to whose voice it was, but the tone had chilled her. Finally, there was the nephew himself, Captain Arthur Hargreaves, recently returned from service in India. We found him at the Colonel's comfortable house in Eaton Square, a handsome young man of 30 with an easy manner and a guardsman's bearing. He greeted us warmly, expressing relief that so distinguished a detective had taken the case. He professed deep affection for his uncle and open admiration for the missing horn. A splendid relic, he called it, though one must admit these old things belong more properly in a museum than a public house. He admitted to heavy gambling losses in the past year, and to occasional frank discussions with his uncle about family finances, yet insisted he had no need of insurance fraud. His boots, I noticed, were finely made but showed a distinctive wear on the outer heel. He smoked Turkish cigarettes almost exclusively, a habit acquired, he said, during travels abroad. Holmes listened to each with his customary impassivity, asking few questions yet noting every hesitation, every flicker of expression. As we walked back toward Baker Street that evening, he remained silent for some time. At length he observed, "We have 4 suspects, Watson, each with motive apparent or concealed, each linked to the scene by some trifling detail. Reynard's cunning and debts, Barker's loyalty strained by poverty, the barmaid's sharp ears, the nephew's extravagance and knowledge of insurance. Yet one thread connects them all more closely than they realize, the temporary hiding place in the cellar, known only to those intimate with the house." I confessed that the case seemed to me a tangle of possibilities. Holmes merely smiled. "Soon, Watson," said he, "we shall draw the knot tight." For several days following our interviews, Holmes remained in a state of quiet intensity that I had come to recognize as the prelude to one of his great deductive triumphs. He scarcely left our rooms in Baker Street, pacing the floor in his mouse-colored dressing gown, filling the air with the acrid smoke of his black shag tobacco, and occasionally scraping discordantly upon his violin as though wrestling with some invisible adversary. I knew better than to interrupt him with questions. Experience had taught me that his mind was ranging over the facts like a hound, quartering a covert, seeking the true line of the scent amid a tangle of false ones. At length, on the evening of the 4th day, he threw himself into his armchair with a sudden air of resolution and bade me draw up my chair opposite him. "The case is all but complete, Watson," said he, lighting his pipe with a spill from the fire. "What seemed a knot of contradictions is now a straight and simple thread. Let me lay before you the chain of reasoning that has led me to the truth." He began, as always, with the physical clues we had gathered at the scene. "Consider first the velvet stand. The dust upon it was disturbed only on the left side, a light brushing, not a wipe. This tells us that the horn was not lifted vertically, as one might expect in a hurried theft, but slid carefully sideways and downward, as though passed beneath the level of the bar to a waiting hand. Such a maneuver requires both knowledge of the stand's exact height and the opportunity afforded by the crowd's distraction." He next turned to the boot prints in the sawdust. 2 sets interested me, the lighter impressions approaching the bar and the deeper ones departing toward the cellar door. The difference in weight is unmistakable, approximately the weight of a solid silver horn carried in a coat pocket or beneath an arm. The pattern of wear on the outer heel matches precisely the boots worn by Captain Arthur Hargreaves when we visited him at Eaton Square. Reynard's shoes are narrow and fashionably pointed. Barker's are heavy and nailed. The barmaid, of course, wore light indoor slippers. Only the captain's boots fit the print. The Turkish tobacco ash, he continued, sealed the identification. Latakia with Perique, a rare and expensive blend. Reynard smokes cheap Virginian. Barker contents himself with a clay pipe of strong twist. Miss Thorne does not smoke at all. Only the captain indulges in those distinctive Turkish cigarettes, the ash of which I found scattered not only near the bar, but also upon the top step of the cellar stairs, dropped, no doubt, in the excitement of concealment. The faint scratch on the cellar door lock presented no difficulty. A key inserted hastily in semi-darkness will often catch the edge of the plate. The landlord's key shows no such fresh mark. He handles it daily and with care. But a man using it for the first time in haste, perhaps borrowed or quietly taken from the hook behind the bar, would be less careful. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. Now we come to motive and opportunity. Reynard's debts are real enough, but he is a gambler who thrives on risk. He would have sold the horn openly on the continent rather than stage an elaborate concealment. Barker's loyalty is genuine. 30 years of service do not lie. Miss Thorne, though observant, had neither the strength nor the occasion to carry the horn below. That leaves Captain Arthur Hargreaves, deeply in debt after losses at cards, yet heir presumptive to his uncle's fortune. He spoke freely to me of insurance, even joking that family heirlooms were better protected by Lloyd's than by velvet stands in public houses. The overheard fragment, "That horn will be mine yet," was his own voice, spoken in bravado to a companion who later denied it, out of misplaced loyalty. The plan, Holmes explained, had been simple, yet bold. During the height of the evening's revelry, while attention was fixed upon a heated argument between two huntsmen at the far end of the room, the captain had leaned across the bar as though to order another drink. In that moment, shielded by the bodies of others, he had slid the horn from its stand and passed it beneath the counter to his left hand. A moment later, under cover of bidding good night to a group near the fire, he had slipped behind the bar, perfectly natural for a regular who knew the house well, and descended to the cellar. There he pried up the loose floorboard, deposited the horn, and returned upstairs, rejoining the company with no one the wiser. The deeper boot prints marked his return, the dropped ash his nervous haste. He had intended, Holmes continued, to let a decent interval pass, perhaps a week or two, then discover the horn in the cellar himself, claiming it must have been hidden there by a mischievous reveller or a light-fingered stranger. The insurance claim could then be quietly withdrawn, suspicion lifted, and the family honour preserved. But our unexpected involvement and the Colonel's determination to recover the heirloom at once had forced him to leave it where it lay. "One final link," said Holmes, producing a small object from his pocket. A silver cigarette case engraved with the captain's initials, found by the landlord that very afternoon, wedged behind a barrel in the cellar. Dropped in the dark, no doubt, and overlooked in the perpetrator's hurried departure. It bears traces of the same velvet dust that clung to the stand. I listened in growing amazement as the scattered fragments fell into place. What had seemed a bewildering tangle of suspicion now revealed itself as a single clear design. "But Holmes," I exclaimed. "How could he risk such a thing in a room full of witnesses?" My friend smiled, that thin, enigmatic smile. "Precisely because it was full of witnesses, Watson. In a deserted room, every movement is noticed. In a crowd, a man may vanish for 30 seconds, and return without remark. The fox, you see, relied upon the very hounds that should have guarded the quarry." He rose and reached for his coat. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall return to the Fox and Hounds. The Colonel has agreed to assemble all parties concerned. The horn shall be restored, and a family matter settled without the intervention of Scotland Yard." As I retired that night, I marvelled once more at the powers of my extraordinary friend. From dust, ash, and the faint imprint of a boot heel, he had reconstructed not only the crime, but the mind of the criminal who conceived it. The following afternoon saw us once more within the familiar walls of the Fox and Hounds. Colonel Hargreaves, acting upon Holmes's quiet suggestion, had requested the presence of all those principally concerned: Mr. Felix Reynard, Jem Barker, Miss Elsie Thorne, and, of course, his nephew, Captain Arthur Hargreaves. The landlord had closed the house to the public for an hour, and a subdued group assembled around the very bar from which the silver horn had vanished. A constrained silence hung over the company. Glances were exchanged, but few words. Holmes stood with his back to the empty velvet stand, his lean figure erect, his eyes bright with that keen, almost predatory alertness which told me the chase was drawing to its close. The Colonel sat nearby, his military bearing stiffened by anxiety. Reynard lounged against a post with studied nonchalance, though his fingers toyed restlessly with his cane. Barker stood stiffly, cap in hand, his weathered face expressionless. Miss Thorne remained behind the bar, pale but composed. The captain, perhaps the least affected in appearance, offered cigarettes all round and lit his own with a steady hand. When all was settled, Holmes began in that quiet, precise voice which somehow commanded instant attention. "Colonel Hargreaves," said he, "you have asked me to recover your missing heirloom and to discover the hand that removed it. I am happy to inform you that both objects are achieved. The horn lies at this moment beneath a loose floorboard in your cellar, exactly where it was placed on the night of the theft. It is undamaged and may be restored to its stand within minutes." A murmur of astonishment rippled through the room. The colonel half rose from his seat. "Beneath my own cellar? But how—" "Patience, sir," Holmes interposed gently. "Permit me to lay the facts before you in their proper order." He then recounted with merciless clarity the chain of evidence I have already described. The brushed dust upon the stand, the differing boot prints, the Turkish ash, the scratched lock, the disturbed board below. Each point was delivered calmly, yet with such precision that it fell upon the listeners like a succession of measured blows. When he reached the identification of the boots and the cigarette ash, all eyes turned involuntarily toward Captain Hargreaves. The young man's face had grown pale, but he attempted a light laugh. "Come now, Mr. Holmes," said he, "these are trifles. A man may scatter ash anywhere, and boots wear in 100 patterns." "Quite so," returned Holmes evenly, "yet when those trifles converge upon one individual alone, they cease to be trifles. There remains, however, one final proof." He turned to the landlord, who had been waiting in the passage. "Briggs, if you please, bring the item you discovered this morning." The landlord entered bearing the captain's silver cigarette case, the one engraved with his initials, which had been found wedged behind a barrel in the cellar. He placed it upon the bar. The captain stared at it as though it were a living thing. "That case," continued Holmes, "bears upon its inner surface faint traces of the same crimson velvet that lined the horn's stand, transferred, no doubt, when it was hastily thrust into the same pocket that concealed the horn during its brief journey below. The monogram removes any lingering doubt." For a long moment silence reigned. Then Captain Hargreaves seemed to shrink within himself. The cigarette fell from his fingers, and he sank onto a nearby settle, covering his face with his hands. "It is true," he said at last, his voice muffled and broken. "God help me, it is true. I intended no permanent theft, only a temporary concealment so that the insurance might be claimed and my debts settled. I meant to discover it later and restore it quietly. I never dreamed it would come to this." The colonel rose slowly, his face a study in conflicting emotions, anger, sorrow, and a deep, abiding grief. "Arthur," he said hoarsely, "you are my sister's only son. For her sake and for the sake of our name, this matter shall go no further than these walls. But you will leave England. I shall arrange a remittance sufficient to discharge your immediate obligations, and you will make your own way henceforth. The horn remains where it has always belonged, with the family that has honored it." The young man could only nod, tears standing in his eyes. No one else spoke. Reynard looked away. Barker's weathered face showed only pity. Miss Thorne quietly busied herself polishing an already spotless glass. Holmes watched the scene with detached compassion. When the horn was brought up from the cellar, gleaming as brightly as ever, and replaced upon its stand, he inclined his head to the colonel. "The case is concluded, sir. I trust the matter is now settled to your satisfaction." We took our leave shortly afterward. As we stepped into the street, the fog had lifted a little. and a pale sun glinted upon the wet pavements. Holmes walked in silence for some minutes, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his ulster. "A sad affair, Watson," he remarked at length. "Greed wearing the mask of necessity and family loyalty strained to breaking, yet the horn is restored and a greater scandal averted." I could not help observing, "You might have summoned the police, Holmes." The evidence was overwhelming. He shook his head. "There are times, Watson, when justice is better served by discretion than by the rigid application of the law. The Colonel's forgiveness, hard though it was, will do more to redeem that young man than any term in prison. Besides," he added with a wry smile, "the fox has lost his brush this time, and the hound of consequence has run him to earth without need of the pack." I made no reply, but as we continued toward Baker Street, I reflected once more upon the singular gifts of my friend, gifts that could unravel the most tangled skein of crime, yet which were ever tempered by an understanding of the frailer side of human nature. Thus ended the adventure I have chronicled under the title of The Case of the Fox and Hound. The silver horn was restored to its velvet stand behind the bar of the little Belgravia public house, where, I dare say, it gleams to this day, a silent witness to the frailties and strengths of human nature. Colonel Hargreaves, though deeply wounded by his nephew's betrayal, bore the affair with the stoical dignity of an old soldier. Captain Arthur Hargreaves sailed for Canada within the month, and rumour has it that he has since made a respectable life for himself in the Dominion, far from the temptations of cards and the hunting field. Mr. Felix Reynard, his reputation untouched by suspicion, continued his precarious dance with fortune, though I believe the events of that evening sobered him for a time. Jem Barker remained in the Colonel's service until his retirement, loyal as ever, tending the hounds with the same quiet devotion he had shown for 3 decades. Miss Elsie Thorne married a steady young brewer a year or 2 later, and I'm told became the capable landlady of a thriving establishment in Kensington. As for Sherlock Holmes, the case afforded him little of the danger or intellectual excitement he craved in his more celebrated investigations. Yet he professed himself satisfied with its outcome. "It is not always the grand conspiracies or the desperate villains that test the detective, Watson," he remarked one evening as we sat before our fire in Baker Street. "Often it is the small domestic trespass, the lie told to protect a loved one, the theft born of desperation rather than malice, that reveals most clearly the workings of the human heart. In such cases, the restoration of equilibrium is reward enough." I could not but agree. Though the affair lacked the darker hues of some of our adventures, it possessed a certain quiet pathos that lingered in my mind. It reminded me, as Holmes's cases so often did, that truth is rarely comfortable, yet it is always preferable to the slow corrosion of deceit. Looking back across the years, I see that little episode at the Fox and Hounds as emblematic of much that I witnessed at my friend's side. The triumph of observation over obscurity, of reason over impulse, and, upon occasion, of mercy over strict justice. The fox may run with all the cunning in the world, but in the end the steady hound of evidence will bring him to bay. And so I lay down my pen upon this minor, yet not uncharacteristic adventure of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The fogs of London have rolled away. The hunting season has come and gone many times since that autumn evening in 1897. But the memory of that gleaming silver horn and the lessons it taught remain vivid still. I remain, as ever, your faithful chronicler, John H. Watson, M.D.